People are fascinated by the idea of mind control. So, wouldn't it be great if you could make other people do, think, or feel what you want them to, and they couldn't resist? And wouldn't it be terrible if other people could make you think, do, or feel what they want you to, and you couldn't resist? And this idea of mind control you find throughout history in many different cultures. So, for instance, where's my clicker? For instance, on Haiti, in the voodoo cult, a zombie is an undead slave who is under the control of a sorcerer, and he has no will of his own. But you see this idea in all sorts of cultures, and you see it with us today still. So, for instance, on the internet, when there is a conspiracy theory, then mind control is often an element of it. There are also people who find the idea of mind control very tempting. So, for instance, there is such a thing as mind control pornography. There's never been a period as preoccupied with mind control as the 1950s. It was the Cold War, and people in the free world were terrified that the communists, the Soviets, the Chinese, had developed a weapon of psychological warfare, a weapon with which they could control the minds of their own population and of anybody who fell into their hands. And that weapon was called brainwashing. It was thought at first that brainwashing worked with hypnosis and conditioning. And the idea was that the victims were first drugged and tortured to make them compliant. And then when they were finally willing to cooperate, they had the same message repeated to them again and again, until they became hypnotized by it. And then, if they repeated the message, they were rewarded. So the idea was brainwashing is a matter of hypnosis and conditioning. And in that way, an idea could be inserted into somebody's mind. And as a result, people became like puppets or robots, machines who mechanically repeated what they had been trained to say. But when scientists, psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists started to look into what the communists were actually doing, they saw something quite different. First of all, they noticed that brainwashing wasn't just one thing. There were lots of different practices and techniques involved. And sometimes the aim was to produce a false confession in a show trial, because that was good propaganda. And sometimes the idea was to convert people to communist dogma. And sometimes the aim was to make a whole group of people or the whole population think in the same way. So there were lots of different practices and techniques involved. But what the scientists noticed was that there was more to it than just breaking people's resistance and bringing them under control. So yes, people were often tortured, But what happened afterwards was not so much a matter of conditioning and hypnosis, but it was more like a conversation or a debate with persuasion and argumentation. So the way it worked in general terms was that an interrogator would first try to get to know the victim personally, would try to see what kind of person he was dealing with, and try to create a relationship with this person. And then he would start to work with that person together towards a confession or a conversion by encouraging him when he was talkative, by punishing him when he fell silent, but most of all by arguing. So arguing why it was a crime, what he had done, or why it was wrong to think the way he did. So it was a rhetorical process. And it was most important in that process to give the victim a good reason to cooperate, because the aim was that the victim would take responsibility for what he was being trained to say. He had to make it his own. And to make that step, he had to be given a good reason. The Chinese, in particular, were adamant that the confession or the conversion had to be sincere. And so the last step always had to be taken by the victim. And for that, he needed a good reason. So it wasn't enough just to repeat what he had been trained to say. It had to come from the heart. And Chinese thought reform, that was a process that could take years. So brainwashing was lots of different things, but it was always not only a matter of control, not only a matter of coercion, but it was always a collaborative process of a rhetorical nature, of an argumentative nature, in which the interrogator and the victim were working together towards a common goal, a conversion or a confession. So, was brainwashing a matter of control? Yes and no. On the one hand, the interrogator had full control over the situation. The victim couldn't leave. It was the interrogator who controlled whether the victim got enough food, whether he could sleep or not, what sort of information he was given. But within that situation of total control, interrogator and victim prisoner had to work together towards that goal of conversion or confession. And as I said, the goal was that the victim would be goaded towards taking responsibility for what he was supposed to say. The social scientist, the social psychologist even, Edgar Schein, I'm sorry this is a bit small, called the process coercive persuasion. And that neatly summarizes these two sides of that brainwashing process. On the one hand, it was coercive, it was violent, and on the other hand, it was rhetorical. On the one hand, it was a matter of control of the interrogator over the victim, but on the other hand, it was a cooperation between the two. So, that was history. What is the relevance of such a story now? What can we learn from this? One thing that we can learn from it, and one lesson that should have been drawn from it, is that violence coercion is of limited use when you're interrogating people. But that illusion of mind control still lingers on. So in 2002, 2 American psychologists went to the CIA and told the CIA, we have a method that is guaranteed to make people talk and tell the truth. If you do things according to this method, you will always get results. And what they were proposing were the infamous enhanced interrogation techniques that were used in the war on terror. And the idea behind it, again, is that illusion of control, of mind control. What they had done, basically, is to copy a set of Chinese torture techniques from the 1950s, added to them the technique of waterboarding, but they'd left out these rhetorical, persuasive aspects of brainwashing. These enhanced interrogation techniques were not only evil, they were also useless. No useful information ever came out of these interrogations. And these psychologists, and particularly the CIA funded a lot of these studies into brainwashing in the 1950s, should have known this. That is one lesson that can be drawn from this history of brainwashing. Thank you.